There's a stone block sitting in a quarry in Pennsylvania that modern construction companies refuse to move. Not because it's too heavy for their equipment. They have cranes rated for 100 tons. This stone weighs 80. They refuse because of what happened the last time someone tried. In 2017, a documentary team hired a construction company to demonstrate how ancient builders moved megalithic stones. The goal was simple. Cut a block matching the size and weight of stones found at sites like Baalbek or Sacsayhuaman. Move it 100 meters. Lift it 20 feet. Position it with the precision we see in ancient structures. They had every advantage the ancients supposedly lacked. Hydraulic cranes, computer-controlled positioning systems, laser measurement tools, engineers with decades of experience. And they failed, not partially, completely. The cranes could lift the stone, barely, but they couldn't position it with any precision. Every attempt to lower it into an exact position resulted in the stone shifting, grinding against adjacent blocks, creating gaps and misalignments. After 6 days of attempts, they gave up. The documentary never aired. The stone still sits in that quarry, and the construction company added a clause to their contracts. No megalithic replication projects. I found the internal project report in an industry archive. The chief engineer wrote something that stopped me cold. After documenting all the technical failures, he added a final note. We are missing something fundamental. The ancients either possessed technology we cannot imagine, or they possessed physical capabilities we do not have. I suspect the latter. The stones themselves suggest builders of considerable size and strength. Builders of considerable size and strength. That sentence sent me down a path of research that would take 5 years, cost me professional relationships, and lead to a conclusion most people aren't ready to hear. What if we can't replicate megalithic construction, not because we lack their knowledge, but because we lack their bodies? What if the builders weren't the same species we are? What if they were giants? And what if those giants were Tartaria? Let me show you the evidence, because once you see it, you can never look at old buildings the same way again. Start with something simple. Doors. Everyone understands doors. You build a door tall enough for people to walk through comfortably. Maybe add a foot or two for clearance and aesthetics. That's architecture. That's common sense. So explain the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in Sofia, Bulgaria. The cathedral was completed in 1912, just over 100 years ago, well within the modern era. Supposedly built by normal-sized human beings using documented construction techniques. The building is beautiful. Byzantine Revival architecture, ornate details, golden domes. Tourists visit every day. But walk up to the main entrance and something feels wrong. The doors are massive, not decorative arches above normal height doors. The actual functional doors that open and close. They're 22 feet tall. 22 feet for a door, a functional door that people use. The average human height in 1912 was about 5 feet 6 inches. Add a generous 2 feet for clearance and aesthetic proportion, and you'd build a door maybe 8 feet tall. 10 feet if you wanted it to feel grand and impressive. This door is 22 feet, almost 3 times what human proportions would require. You could argue it's purely ceremonial, meant to inspire awe. Except the proportions are wrong for that too. When you stand in front of a door that's 22 feet tall and you're 5.5 feet tall, you don't feel awed. You feel like a child, like you're in a space built for adults and you're too small to belong there. That's the feeling, and it's everywhere in old architecture. The main hall of Alexander Nevsky has ceilings at 40 feet. The secondary corridors, the working spaces where priests and staff would have moved through daily, have 15-foot ceilings, not 40-foot ceremonial heights. 15-foot functional corridor ceilings. 15 feet is exactly what you'd need if the people using those corridors were 10 to 12 feet tall. I started measuring buildings, not as an architect appreciating aesthetic choices, as an investigator documenting evidence. Buildings constructed before 1850 across Europe, Russia, and North America, and the pattern repeated everywhere with disturbing consistency. Grand Central Terminal in New York, built 1913. Main hall windows are 40 feet tall. But here's what nobody talks about. The service corridors, the passages used by workers have 14-foot ceilings. The ticket windows, the functional workspaces where normal operations happened, have 12-foot clearances. Those aren't ceremonial spaces. Those are work areas, and they're proportioned for people significantly taller than modern humans. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Construction began 1754. The grand halls have 60-foot ceilings. Yes, ceremonial and impressive. But the private chambers, the working offices, the service hallways consistently show doorways at 18 feet and corridor heights at 14 to 15 feet. Parliament Building in Budapest, completed 1904. Entry doors 20 feet tall. Committee chamber ceilings at 18 feet. Administrative offices with 12-foot door frames. These aren't random aesthetic choices. These are functional dimensions repeated across continents and centuries, as if there was a standard, a template, proportions that made sense for the people who actually used these buildings, people who were much, much larger than we are. I found something in an architectural history book that no one seems to want to discuss. Published in 1931 by a historian named Geoffrey Markham, Ibao Imiti Hitkiniti documented what he called the dimensional anomaly of pre-industrial architecture. He measured hundreds of buildings across Europe and noted that functional spaces, not ceremonial halls, but actual working areas, consistently showed dimensions proportioned for human heights of 10 to 12 feet. His conclusion was careful, almost fearful. He wrote, "The builders of these structures either possessed unusual aesthetic sensibilities that caused them to waste considerable resources on unnecessarily large functional spaces, or they were designing for occupants of substantially greater stature than modern populations. I leave it to future researchers to determine which explanation is correct." The book was published once, never reprinted. Markham never published on architecture again, and the dimensional anomaly he documented has been quietly ignored for 90 years. But the buildings are still here. The doors are still 22 feet tall. The corridors still have 15-foot ceilings. And every single day, normal-sized humans walk through spaces built for giants, never asking why everything is proportioned wrong, unless it's not wrong, unless we're wrong, unless we're the anomaly. The smaller beings who inherited spaces built by and for a larger race. So if buildings before 1850 were proportioned for giants, where are the giants? Where are the bones? Where's the physical evidence that these larger beings actually existed? I found them in hundreds of newspaper reports published across America between 1850 and 1920. Reports that appeared regularly, documented carefully, and then suddenly stopped being published, as if someone had decided the public shouldn't know anymore. I spent 8 months searching digitized newspaper archives, small-town papers, major city publications, scientific journals, regional news, all of them freely available in public databases that anyone can access. I was looking for one specific thing: reports of unusually large human skeletal remains. I found over 500 documented cases. Let me read you a few. Exact quotes from actual newspapers, dates and page numbers included. This is not folklore. This is documented journalism from the period. The New York Times, May 4th, 1856, page 3. Workmen excavating for railway construction near East Wheeling, Ohio, discovered skeletal remains of extraordinary size. The femur bone measured 32 inches in length, suggesting an individual of at least 9 feet in height when living. The skull was of proportions equally remarkable, with a cranial capacity exceeding normal human measurements by significant margin. The remains have been carefully packaged and sent to the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia for detailed examination and preservation. 9 feet tall, documented, measured, sent to a scientific institution. San Francisco Chronicle, August 12, 1895. Miners working in the Lovelock Cave system in Nevada have made a discovery that challenges conventional understanding of human history in the region. Multiple skeletal remains of individuals estimated between 8 and 10 feet in stature have been uncovered in a deep chamber. Most remarkably, the remains show evidence of red hair still attached to several skulls. The bone structure differs notably from modern human skeletal proportions, with longer limbs and larger joint surfaces. Stone tools and woven baskets found alongside the remains suggest a culture of considerable sophistication. The Smithsonian Institution has been notified and will assume custody of the findings for study. 8 to 10 feet tall, red hair, different skeletal proportions, advanced tools, multiple individuals, all sent to the Smithsonian. Arizona Gazette, April 5, 1909. The paper ran a front-page story with a headline that's now famous in alternative archaeology circles. Explorations in Grand Canyon reveal evidence of ancient civilization. The article described a discovery made by a man named G.E. Kincaid, who claimed to have found a vast underground complex containing artifacts and skeletal remains. The article specifically mentions the unusual size of the remains and states that the Smithsonian Institute has taken control of the site and all findings. The pattern in these reports is consistent and disturbing. Large skeletal remains are found, between 7 and 12 feet tall, often with unusual characteristics: elongated skulls, double rows of teeth, 6 fingers, extra vertebrae, always in North America, usually in the Ohio Valley, Nevada, California, or the Pacific Northwest, always described as being sent to the Smithsonian or other major institutions for examination. And here's what makes this evidence so compelling. These weren't sensationalist tabloids. These were respected newspapers: the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, regional papers documenting local discoveries with the same seriousness they reported any archaeological find. Between 1850 and 1900, reports of giant skeletal remains appear multiple times per year across the country. Different states, different papers, different discoverers, but consistent descriptions, consistent measurements, consistent disposition to scientific institutions. Then something changes. Around 1900, the frequency decreases. By 1920, the reports stop almost completely. Not because giant skeletons stopped being found, because newspapers stopped reporting them. A researcher named Ross Hamilton spent 30 years documenting these reports. In 2007, he published a book called A Tradition of Giants, compiling hundreds of these newspaper accounts. In his introduction, he wrote something that crystallized what I'd been noticing. The suppression wasn't subtle. Editors received directives from major publishers. The Smithsonian issued official positions classifying such reports as errors or misidentifications. Academic institutions created policies discouraging discussion of anomalous skeletal finds. What was once front-page news became a forbidden topic within 2 decades. The evidence didn't disappear. The willingness to acknowledge it did. The evidence didn't disappear. It just went somewhere. Somewhere the public couldn't access it anymore. So I went looking for where it went. In 2019, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Smithsonian Institution. Very specific, very detailed. I wanted records of skeletal remains accessioned between 1850 and 1920, matching the descriptions in the newspaper reports I'd documented. Archaeological acquisition records, storage locations, measurements, any existing physical remains. The Smithsonian has a legal obligation to respond to FOIA requests within a certain time frame. It took them 11 months. The response, when it finally came, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion. 3 pages of carefully worded nothing. But let me read you the key passage, because the language is important. The Smithsonian Institution has conducted a thorough search of records relating to your request. We have no records specifically matching the descriptions provided. Skeletal remains acquired during the period in question were processed according to protocol standard for that era, which did not include detailed dimensional documentation beyond basic cataloging requirements. No remains matching the specific unusual characteristics described, such as excessive height or anomalous skeletal features, are currently housed in our collections or are documented in our accessible archives. Read that carefully. They didn't say giant skeletons were never found. They said they have no records matching my descriptions. They didn't say the remains don't exist. They said they're not currently in collections and not documented in accessible archives. Currently. Accessible. Those words are doing a lot of work. The letter continues. Historical accession practices varied significantly across different time periods and different departments within the institution. Some early records may have been lost, damaged, or are stored in formats that are not readily searchable through modern database systems. The institution has undergone numerous reorganizations and collection consolidations over its history, and complete documentation for all historical acquisitions cannot be guaranteed. Cannot be guaranteed. May have been lost. Not readily searchable. This is the Smithsonian, one of the world's premier research institutions, with resources to catalogue and preserve millions of specimens. And they're telling me they can't find records of something hundreds of newspapers documented being sent to them. But here's where it gets interesting, because while the Smithsonian claims to have no records, I found records they created. The National Archives houses certain Smithsonian administrative documents, internal memos, departmental communications, things that weren't meant for public access but ended up in the archives through bureaucratic processes. And in those documents, there are references to exactly what the Smithsonian now claims doesn't exist. Smithsonian Internal Memorandum, reference number 7896-B, dated November 14, 1895. Subject line reads, Disposition of anomalous skeletal material from Western excavations. The memo discusses several acquisitions from Nevada, California, and Arizona. It specifically uses the phrase specimens of excessive dimensional proportions, requiring specialized storage considerations. The memo recommends restricted access pending scientific consensus on proper classification and interpretation. Restricted access, scientific consensus, proper classification. That's 1895, 30 years before the newspaper report stopped. They were already deciding these finds required special handling, required restricted access, required consensus on how to interpret them before anyone could study them. Another document. Smithsonian Physical Anthropology Department Internal Note, 1923, much more direct. The note discusses what to do with skeletal material that, quote, doesn't conform to accepted models of human variation, end quote. It recommends these materials be, quote, segregated from public-facing collections and made available only to researchers with specific institutional credentials and approved research proposals, end quote. They're not denying the material exists, they're describing how to hide it. But the most damning evidence comes from a former employee. In 2014, a woman named Dr. Laura Henderson gave an interview to a magazine called Alternative Archaeology. She'd worked in the Smithsonian's Physical Anthropology Department from 1987 to 2002. 15 years inside the institution. She described storage areas in the Natural History Museum that required special clearance to access. Areas that weren't on tour routes, weren't available to most researchers. When she asked why certain storage rooms were restricted, she was told they contained materials requiring special institutional permission. On one occasion, she saw a catalogue entry in an old database system they were migrating to new software. The entry described skeletal remains from Nevada, accessioned in 1897. The catalogue included a femur length measurement of 28 inches. For context, a normal human femur is about 18 inches. 28 inches would indicate a person well over 8 feet tall. Next to the measurement was a note: restricted access, do not display, do not include in public databases, refer inquiries to department head. When she asked her supervisor about the entry, she was told it was a measurement error, a mistake made during original cataloguing. But she saw multiple similar entries during the database migration, all marked restricted, all with measurements indicating individuals of exceptional size, all with notes saying not to display or discuss. She was told these were all cataloguing errors from the 1800s, when measurement standards were less rigorous. But the measurements were consistent. The restrictions were consistent. And when the database migration was complete, none of these entries appeared in the new system. They'd been deleted, removed from the accessible record. In 1996, the Smithsonian underwent what they called a major reorganization of their biological anthropology collections. Thousands of specimens were consolidated. Storage was optimized. Materials were deaccessioned. Official reason given was space constraints and the removal of redundant specimens. A document from that reorganization leaked in 2008. It lists items approved for disposal. Most entries are exactly what you'd expect: duplicate specimens, poorly preserved materials, things with unclear provenance. But scattered through the list are entries that don't fit that pattern. Item 734, skeletal material, excessive dimensions, uncertain provenance. Approved for disposal. Item 891, cranial remains, anomalous structural features. Approved for disposal. Item 1203, partial skeleton, dimensional irregularities. Approved for disposal. These aren't descriptions of damaged or redundant materials. These are descriptions of unusual materials being deliberately removed from collections. And disposal, in institutional language, is permanent. These specimens weren't transferred to another institution, weren't returned to tribes or origin sites. They were destroyed. The Smithsonian has no records. Because they eliminated the records. They have no specimens. Because they eliminated the specimens. And they did this systematically, over decades, while telling the public that giant skeletons are myths and misidentifications. But hundreds of newspaper reports say otherwise. Internal Smithsonian documents say otherwise. Former employees say otherwise. The only people who say giant skeletons don't exist are the same institutions that made them disappear. So I had two pieces of evidence: buildings proportioned for giants, newspaper reports, and institutional documents proving giant skeletons existed. But I needed to connect this to Tartaria, to understand not just that giants existed, but where they came from and why they disappeared. I created a map, spent 2 months on it. Every newspaper report of giant skeletal remains I could find. Every building in North America showing the architectural proportions I'd been documenting. Every structure identified as Tartarian architecture. And the overlap was impossible to ignore. The highest concentration of giant skeleton discoveries in North America falls in specific regions: the Ohio River Valley, Nevada, and California, the Pacific Northwest, Arizona, and New Mexico. These are the areas where newspapers most frequently reported finds of skeletal remains between 7 and 12 feet tall. The highest concentration of buildings with giant proportioned architecture in North America, structures with 20-foot doors and 15-foot ceilings, falls in the exact same regions: San Francisco, Salt Lake City, Denver, Chicago, major cities in the Ohio Valley. These are also the exact regions that old maps from the 17 and 1800s show as the western extent of Tartarian influence. Maps that label huge portions of North America as Tartarian territory, before that designation mysteriously disappears from cartography after 1850. The same pattern appears in Europe and Asia. Buildings with giant proportions concentrate in Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Ottoman territories. The exact regions historical maps identify as Tartaria. It's not random, it's not coincidence. The architecture, the skeletal evidence, and the historical maps all point to the same thing. Tartaria wasn't just a civilization. It was a civilization of giants. That's why the buildings are proportioned the way they are. Not aesthetic choice, not ceremonial grandeur, functional necessity. The doors are 20 feet tall because the people who used them needed 20-foot doors. The ceilings are 15 feet because people 12 feet tall need 15-foot ceilings. That's why megalithic construction was possible. Not because they had anti-gravity technology or crystalline energy tools, or any of the more exotic theories. Because they had bodies capable of the work. Arms strong enough to move multi-ton stones. Hands large enough to grip and position blocks with precision. Height enough to work at scales that seem impossible to us. We can't replicate their construction because we can't replicate their bodies. But here's the question that kept me awake. If Tartaria was a global civilization of giants that existed well into the 1800s, where did they go? Why don't we see them anymore? Why did their architecture stop being built? Why did newspaper reports of their remains stop appearing? The answer is in the timeline, and it's darker than you might imagine. The last buildings with giant proportioned architecture were constructed around 1850. After that date, new construction shifts abruptly. Doors become normal height. Ceilings lower to 8 or 9 feet. The proportions change completely within a single generation. Newspaper reports of giant skeletal remains appear regularly from 1850 to 1900, then decrease rapidly and stop by 1920, 70 years. From common enough to report regularly to completely absent from the historical record. Maps stop labeling territories as Tartaria around 1850. The name disappears from cartography. The empire vanishes from official history. And all of this happens right after 1812. I've documented in other research the evidence for catastrophic events in 1812, the global fires, the nuclear signatures in geological layers, the simultaneous destruction of major cities, the climate anomalies, the year without a summer in 1816, the massive social upheavals. What if 1812 wasn't just the destruction of Tartarian infrastructure? What if it was genocide, the deliberate extermination of a race? Think about the evidence. Massive fires consuming cities globally in 1812, nuclear-level heat signatures, destruction concentrated in areas we now know were Tartarian territories, and immediately after, architectural proportions change. Giant-sized buildings stop being constructed, as if the people who needed them were suddenly gone. But some survived, had to have survived, because newspapers keep finding their remains for another 100 years. Giants who escaped the initial destruction, who lived in hiding, who died and were buried by smaller humans who didn't understand what they'd found. And those remains kept appearing until the early 1900s, when institutions like the Smithsonian began systematically collecting and hiding them, not preserving them for study, hiding them to erase the evidence. Because here's what no one wants to admit. The giants weren't just bigger. They represented everything the modern control system couldn't tolerate. You cannot enslave a being 12 feet tall and proportionally stronger than you. You cannot force giants into factory work. You cannot make them economically dependent when they can build their own shelters with their hands, move stones we need machinery to lift, construct infrastructure we can barely maintain. Tartarian giants, with their advanced architecture and their atmospheric energy systems and their contribution-based economy, represented a permanent threat. A population that couldn't be controlled through the mechanisms that work on smaller, weaker humans. So they weren't just defeated, they were exterminated, systematically, globally. The initial destruction in 1812, then hunting down survivors over the next century, collecting their remains when they were found, burying the evidence in institutional basements, stopping newspapers from reporting discoveries, creating academic policies that classified discussion of giants as pseudoscience, and replacing them, repopulating the territories with smaller humans. Humans who would look at 20-foot doors and think it was just grand architecture. Humans who would need banks and wages and control systems. Humans who could be managed. The orphan trains. The incubator baby exhibits at world's fairs. The massive immigration waves of the late 1800s. All happening right after the giants disappeared. Repopulation, replacement. We're not the original inhabitants of this world. We're what came after. The smaller, weaker, more controllable version. Living in buildings sized for the race we replaced. Walking through doors built for people twice our height. And we've been taught not to ask why everything feels slightly too large. Because asking leads to realizing we're not the originals. We're the replacements. Let me show you what we lost in the clearest possible way. The giants, the Tartarian builders, could move 80-ton stones with their hands. We need cranes and still fail to position them accurately. They built structures that have stood for centuries without maintenance. We build structures that crumble within decades. They created megalithic works of such precision that we cannot replicate them with computer-controlled equipment. We create approximations that look crude by comparison. They organize societies around contribution and collective provision. We organized around debt and wage slavery. They built architecture of transcendent beauty and permanent durability. We build strip malls that need renovation every 20 years. They stood 12 feet tall with the strength to match. We stand 6 feet tall and call ourselves the pinnacle of evolution. They powered their cities with atmospheric energy that required no fuel. We burn fossil fuels and pay corporations for every watt. They were free. We are controlled, and that's exactly why they had to die. Because freedom at that scale, with that capability, cannot be tolerated by systems built on creating dependency and scarcity. A race of giants cannot be made to fear homelessness, cannot be made to work for wages they don't need, cannot be controlled through debt because they can build their own wealth with their hands, cannot be managed through the mechanisms that keep smaller humans compliant. So they were burned in 1812, hunted through the 1800s, their remains collected and hidden, their architecture relabeled as human achievement, their history erased so completely that we now think we built the world they left behind. But the evidence remains, in doors too tall for us to reach, in stones too heavy for us to move, in newspaper reports they couldn't fully suppress, in Smithsonian documents admitting what they officially deny, in buildings that whisper the truth if you know how to listen. We are not the builders. We are not the originals. We are what's left after the giants were exterminated, living in their world, using their buildings, claiming their achievements, and forgetting we ever shared this planet with a race that was everything we're told is impossible: 12 feet tall, strong enough to move megalithic stones, advanced enough to build atmospheric energy systems, free enough to be ungovernable. And that combination could not be allowed to survive, so they didn't. The Tartarian giants are gone. Their buildings remain. Their skeletons sit in restricted Smithsonian storage rooms. Their story is labeled as myth and conspiracy. And we, the smaller humans who replace them, are told we're the apex of creation. But every 20-foot door tells a different story. Every newspaper report proves otherwise. Every failed attempt to recreate their construction confirms it. We can't lift the stones they moved, not because we lack their tools, because we lack their bodies. We're not them. We're what came after they were killed. And we've been taught to be proud of our limitations, to celebrate our weakness as progress, to never ask why the world we live in was built for people twice our size. Because asking that question leads to the truth, that giants were real, that Tartaria was their civilization, and that they were exterminated not because they were primitive, but because they were superior. And superiority, true superiority, cannot be tolerated by those who rule through creating and maintaining inferiority. The giants are gone, but their buildings remain, standing as testimony, as evidence, as proof that we're not what we think we are. We're the remnants, living in the ruins of giants, and the doors are still 22 feet tall.